The last thing I remembered before the darkness swallowed me whole was the sound of tires crunching over gravel, fading into the distance like a cruel joke. The damp air smelled of pine needles and distant rain, and the towering trees loomed above me, their gnarled branches casting shadows that twisted into strange shapes. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the notes still crumpled in my trembling hands, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and disbelief. Find your own way home. This is your lesson. The words burned into my mind, each letter pressing against my ribs like a dull knife, their weight crushing the breath from my lungs. I was 16 years old, stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a half-empty water bottle, a granola bar, and the clothes on my back. My parents had always been hard on me, their love measured in discipline and lectures rather than warmth, but this was something different. This wasn't just tough love or another one of their lessons in resilience. This was abandonment. A cold wind swept through the trees, making my already thin hoodie feel like paper against my skin. I wanted to scream, to run after them, to call out and beg for them to turn around. But I knew they wouldn't. That wasn't who they were. They believed struggle made people stronger, that suffering built character, that hardship was a necessary ingredient for success. Maybe they thought I would stumble out of the woods, humbled and grateful for their twisted version of wisdom. Maybe they expected me to show up at the house days later, desperate for forgiveness and understanding. I decided, right then and there, that I would never give them the satisfaction. The first night was the hardest. The darkness felt suffocating, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest morphing into imagined threats. Every rustling leaf sent panic crawling up my spine, every distant howl made me grip my arms tighter against my chest. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but I forced myself to ignore it, my focus shifting entirely to one singular thought. I had to find my way out of here. I was smart enough to know panicking wouldn't help me. My father had always scoffed at my lack of survival skills, mocking me when I hesitated to gut a fish or struggled to light a fire. His voice echoed in my head, sharp and mocking. A real man doesn't need handouts. If you can't survive on your own, you don't deserve to survive at all. But I wasn't trying to survive just to prove a point. I wasn't going to crawl back to them with my head bowed, apologizing for not being the child they wanted. I was going to survive because my life depended on it, and because I refused to let them break me. The first stroke of luck came when I stumbled upon an old, rusted fire pit near a clearing. Whoever had used it before had left behind a few dry pieces of wood, along with a metal container that still smelled faintly of coffee. I spent the better part of an hour trying to start a fire, cursing my frozen fingers and my lack of experience, but eventually the sparks caught. As the flames flickered to life, I felt something shift deep inside me. It wasn't much, but it was proof that I could do something, that I wasn't completely helpless. By the time morning arrived, I had a plan. I walked for hours, using the sun to guide me eastward, where I hoped I would eventually find a road. Every step forward was a silent vow to myself, a promise that I would never forget this moment, never forget the feeling of being discarded like an inconvenience. When I finally saw the first sign of civilization, a dirt path leading to a ranger's station, I knew I had won. The rangers didn't ask too many questions. They assumed I was another reckless teenager who had wandered too far off a trail, and I let them believe it. I gave them a fake name, refusing to let my parents have any way of tracking me down. They offered to call home, but I shook my head, staring at my hands to keep them from seeing the rage simmering beneath my calm exterior. Home wasn't a place I ever intended to return to. I left town that same day, hitchhiking with a trucker who didn't ask too many questions and paid me $20 to help unload cargo. That money got me to a bus station, and from there, I hopped from city to city, picking up odd jobs, learning the kind of skills my parents never thought I was capable of. I worked in diners, gas stations, even a construction site for a while, saving every cent I could. It took years, but I clawed my way up. I worked harder than I ever thought possible, teaching myself everything from finance to coding, taking risks that paid off in ways I never could have imagined. By the time I was 25, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I had built a company from scratch, turning a small investment into a multi-million-dollar success. The same parents who had left me in the woods with nothing had no idea that the son they abandoned had become someone they could never control again. Then, 10 years later, they showed up. They didn't come with apologies or regret. They came with expectations. My father stood in my office, looking smaller than I remembered, his once authoritative posture slumped under the weight of something I couldn't quite place. My mother's eyes darted around the room, taking in the expensive furniture, the city skyline visible from the massive windows behind my desk. They weren't here for a reunion. They were here for money. "We've hit a rough patch," my father admitted, his voice gruff but measured, as if he thought he could still intimidate me into submission. "We need your help." I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled, studying them with the same detached curiosity one might have for a long-forgotten relic from the past. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the irony of it so thick I almost laughed. They had left me for dead, expecting me to struggle, expecting me to suffer. Now, a decade later, they had come crawling back, expecting me to save them. I smiled, slow and deliberate, savoring the anticipation. "I have an offer," I said finally, watching as the flicker of hope ignited in their eyes. They had no idea what was coming next. For a long moment, I simply let the silence stretch between us, savoring the weight of their expectation as they sat across from me. My father's fingers drummed against the arm of the chair, a nervous tick I had never seen from him before. My mother kept glancing at the door, as if she half expected to be ushered out before they could make their request. They had walked into my office believing that they still held some kind of power over me, that the past could be rewritten with a few well-chosen words. I wasn't sure what fantasy had led them to believe I owed them anything, but I was more than happy to wake them up. "You said you needed my help," I said finally, watching as relief flashed across my father's face, quickly masked by his usual look of authority. "What exactly does that mean?" My father cleared his throat, shifting in his chair before leaning forward slightly, as if this was some business negotiation rather than a plea for rescue. "We ran into some financial difficulties a few years ago," he began, carefully measuring his words. "Investments that didn't pan out the way we'd hoped, bad luck with the economy, unexpected expenses. You know how it is." I didn't respond. I wanted to see how far he would go before he cracked, how much he would lie before he realized I already knew the truth. My mother sighed dramatically, reaching out as if she might take my hand, her nails painted the same perfect shade of pink they had always been. "We wouldn't have come to you if we weren't out of options," she added, her voice carrying the practiced sadness of someone who had told the story 100 times before. "The bank is threatening foreclosure on the house. We've fallen behind on payments, and they aren't willing to negotiate anymore." I nodded, keeping my expression carefully neutral, though inside I was already pulling the threads of their story apart. I had expected something like this. The expensive clothes they still wore, the designer purse my mother clutched like a lifeline, the way my father spoke as if he had been a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of his own destruction, it all told me exactly what had happened. They had spent years living beyond their means, gambling on their ability to manipulate others into bailing them out when things got bad. "How much?" I asked, watching as a flicker of something close to triumph passed between them. "250,000 should be enough to cover the debts and give us some breathing room," my father said, his voice taking on that same tone of authority he used to use when giving orders. "With that, we can keep the house and start rebuilding." I let his words settle, pretending to consider them carefully while I leaned back in my chair, my fingers tapping lightly against the desk. 250,000, I repeated, letting the number roll off my tongue as if testing the weight of it. "That's quite a bit." My mother forced a small, tight-lipped smile, the kind that used to work on me when I was younger, the one that made me believe I was being selfish for having needs of my own. "It's an investment in family," she said softly, as if the concept of family had ever meant anything more to them than a convenient excuse. "We know we weren't perfect parents, but we did our best. And now, after everything, isn't this what family is supposed to do? Help each other?" A laugh slipped out before I could stop it, sharp and bitter, filling the room with something dangerously close to amusement. My father's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he straightened his back, as if preparing for battle. He had always been like that, quick to anger when things didn't go his way, convinced that control was his birthright. Help each other, I mused, tilting my head slightly as if the concept were foreign to me. That's an interesting way to put it. My father exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. Listen, we don't have time for games. You have the money. We need it. This is your chance to prove you're better than whatever grudge you've been holding on to. A slow smile spread across my face, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in my father's eyes, something that looked a lot like doubt. He had always been so sure of his control, so confident that I would never turn my back on them. Even after they had left me alone in the woods with nothing but a condescending note and the expectation that I would either find my way home or disappear from their lives forever, he had still believed I would come back. I leaned forward, placing my elbows on the desk, my voice calm and deliberate. I have an offer, I said again, watching as their expressions shifted into something eager, hungry for the solution they believed was coming. I will give you the $250,000 you're asking for. My mother let out a small sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing, her fingers unclenching from the purse she had been gripping so tightly. My father simply nodded, as if my agreement had been inevitable. But I continued, my voice just as even, there's a condition. The moment I said the word, the air shifted. My father stiffened slightly, his eyes narrowing, while my mother forced another one of her tight, carefully curated smiles. What kind of condition? My father asked, his voice careful now, laced with suspicion. I let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it, to make them wonder just how far I was willing to go. Then I folded my hands together and met my father's gaze head-on. I'll give you exactly what you gave me, I said, watching as confusion flickered across their faces. You get one bag, the clothes on your back, and whatever you can carry in your hands. Then, I drop you both off at a remote location with no phone, no money, and no way to call for help. The room went silent. For the first time in my life, I saw my father at a loss for words, his mouth opening slightly before he shut it again, as if he couldn't quite process what I had just said. My mother blinked rapidly, her carefully composed expression faltering as she tried to figure out if I was serious. You'll have to find your own way home, I continued, my voice calm, my heart steady. Consider it a lesson. Just like the one you gave me. My father's face darkened, his hands curling into fists at his sides, while my mother let out a nervous laugh, as if she still thought this was some kind of cruel joke. But I wasn't joking. I had never been more serious in my life. And for the first time, they finally understood exactly what they had done. The silence that stretched between us was thick enough to suffocate, the weight of my words settling over them like a heavy storm cloud. My father's face twisted into something between disbelief and rage, his jaw tightening as if he were physically holding back the outburst simmering beneath his carefully constructed mask of authority. My mother, on the other hand, was staring at me like she didn't recognize the person sitting in front of her, like she had just realized that the son they had abandoned was not the same boy who had once followed their rules without question. You can't be serious, my father finally said, his voice sharp, clipped with the kind of barely contained fury I had seen so many times growing up. He was used to being in control, to dictating the terms of every conversation, every decision, every part of our lives. The idea that I had the power now, that I was the one making the rules, was something he clearly hadn't considered possible. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, letting the moment stretch just long enough for them to feel the full weight of what I was offering. You wanted money, I said evenly, watching the flicker of uncertainty pass between them. You wanted help. And I'm willing to give it to you, on the same terms you once gave me. My mother finally found her voice, her carefully curated demeanor cracking at the edges as she forced a tight, uncertain smile. Sweetheart, this isn't the same thing, she said, her tone dipping into that familiar, coaxing manipulation she had always used when she wanted something from me. You were a child when that happened. We were trying to teach you resilience, to prepare you for the real world. I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that cut through the air like a knife. No, I said, my voice steady, unwavering, unshaken by her attempts to rewrite the past. You weren't teaching me resilience. You were teaching me that I didn't matter to you, that I was disposable, that I was an inconvenience you could abandon like an unwanted burden. Her expression faltered, her lips pressing together as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. My father, however, had had enough. He shot up from his chair, his fists clenched at his sides, his face a storm of barely contained rage. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his voice echoing through the office, his attempt at authority cracking under the weight of the situation. "You're being dramatic. You've made your point. Now, let's be reasonable and discuss real solutions." I didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't rise to meet his anger. Instead, I let his words hang in the air for a moment before I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my desk, my eyes never leaving his. "This is the real solution," I said, my tone quiet, measured, but carrying an undeniable finality. "You either take the offer as it stands, or you walk out of here with nothing." My father's breath came hard and fast, his nostrils flaring as he struggled to contain the fury building inside him. He had spent his entire life dictating the terms of every interaction, controlling every outcome, bending people to his will through sheer force of dominance. But this time, he had no control. My mother placed a shaky hand on his arm, trying to calm him, her voice a desperate whisper. Let's talk about this," she pleaded, her carefully constructed persona slipping into something closer to panic. "Surely, we can come to a different arrangement. You have so much, and we're your parents." A strange calm settled over me as I watched them scramble, their carefully built illusions shattering piece by piece. This was what they had wanted, a lesson. They had wanted to teach me how to survive, how to fend for myself, how to learn that no one was coming to save me. They had expected me to crawl back to them, humbled and grateful, desperate for their approval, for their help. Instead, I had done the unthinkable. I had survived. And I had thrived. I stood slowly, walking around the desk until I was standing directly in front of them, my eyes locked onto theirs, my voice quiet but unwavering. "Do you remember what it felt like?" I asked, watching as confusion flickered across their faces. "Do you remember the moment you drove away and left me there alone in the middle of nowhere? Did you feel proud? Did you feel like you had done something good?" My father's gaze darted away, his lips pressing into a tight line, but my mother just shook her head, a sheen of tears forming in her eyes. "We didn't think you would," she swallowed hard, as if she couldn't bring herself to say the words. "We thought you would come home. We thought you'd find your way back." I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of those words settle over me. "I did find my way back," I said softly, tilting my head slightly as I studied her. "Just not to you." Her face crumpled slightly, her hand tightening around my father's sleeve, as if searching for some kind of support. He, however, was still locked in his own battle of pride and fury, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort it took to keep himself from lashing out. I stepped back, crossing my arms over my chest. "I'll give you until the end of the day to decide," I said, watching as their faces twisted with shock. "If you accept, I'll make the arrangements and drop you off first thing in the morning. If you refuse, you're free to leave and figure things out on your own." My father's nostrils flared, his hands clenching at his sides, his entire body radiating barely contained rage. "You would really do this to your own parents?" He spat, his voice dripping with disbelief. "After everything we've done for you?" I met his gaze, unblinking, unwavering. "After everything you've done to me?" I countered, my voice like steel. "Yes." My mother let out a small, broken sound, her eyes wide and pleading, but I had nothing left for them. No sympathy, no regret, no guilt. They had taught me a lesson all those years ago, but they had never expected me to be the one giving the final exam. And now, the test had begun. The moment I set the ultimatum, the room changed. The air grew dense with unspoken words, and the weight of my offer hung between us like an axe, poised to drop. My father's face was stone, his expression unreadable, though the fire in his eyes told me he was barely keeping himself from exploding. My mother, on the other hand, was unraveling before my eyes, her hands clenching and unclenching in her lap as she processed the fact that, for the first time in their lives, they weren't in control of the outcome. I leaned against my desk, crossing my arms over my chest, my voice calm but firm as I continued. "I don't expect you to like it," I said, watching as my father's lip curled in disgust, "but you don't get to stand here and act like I owe you something. Not after what you did." My mother let out a shaky breath, her hands wringing together as she tried to summon the right words to pull me back, to soften me, to manipulate me into seeing them as the victims. "Sweetheart," she started, her voice layered with forced patience, "we were trying to help you back then. You were so soft, so sheltered, and we knew the world wouldn't be kind. We did what we thought was necessary." I let out a short laugh, shaking my head at the audacity of it all, at the sheer ridiculousness of them still believing their cruelty had been some kind of twisted kindness. "You left me in the middle of nowhere with no food, no money, no way to call for help," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "You drove off without looking back, and now you want to sit here and tell me it was for my own good?" My father exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "It was a goddamn lesson," he snapped, his voice laced with frustration. "We thought you'd figure it out and come home stronger. We thought you'd learn to stop expecting handouts, to stop acting like the world owed you something." I stared at him, taking in the way he spoke, the way he truly believed every word he said, as if his actions had been justified, as if he had been right. He still thought that what he had done to me had made me stronger, that the suffering he inflicted had been a necessary trial, a test of worthiness. But he didn't realize that he had only made one mistake. He had assumed that when I found my way out, I would come crawling back. Instead, I had walked away forever. I pushed off the desk and straightened to my full height, looking down at them both as I spoke. "You wanted to teach me something," I said, my voice even, steady, unshaken by the storm in front of me. "And I did learn. I learned that family is nothing more than the people who choose to stand by you when things are hard. And I learned that you don't qualify." My mother's breath hitched, her face contorting as if I had struck her, but I didn't flinch. I let the words sit there, let them settle into the cracks of their carefully crafted illusion of themselves. They had spent years telling themselves a story where they had been the wise parents, the architects of my success. But the truth was a different story entirely, and now they were being forced to hear it. My father inhaled deeply, straightening his shoulders, his pride still too thick, too ingrained, to let him show anything close to defeat. "You really think you're better than us now?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, laced with something dangerously close to fury. "You think a few years of success erases where you came from?" I tilted my head slightly, studying him, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as the man I had once feared, not as the authority figure who had dictated my childhood, but as something much smaller, something much more fragile than he had ever let himself believe. "It's not about where I came from," I said, keeping my voice measured. "It's about where I'm going. And you're not part of that." My mother let out a small, broken sound, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We don't have anywhere else to go." I watched her carefully, the way her desperation cracked through the walls she had spent years maintaining. For a brief second, I considered what would have happened if I had been a different person, if I had been the son they had expected, the one who would have folded under their words, the one who would have opened his wallet and handed them exactly what they wanted. But I wasn't that son. Not anymore. I took a slow breath, keeping my expression unreadable as I responded. "You have options," I said, my voice unyielding. "You just don't like them." My father let out a sharp breath, his patience snapping, his mask of control crumbling as he took a step forward, his face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" I held up a hand, cutting him off, my tone dropping into something cold, something final. "You don't get to raise your voice at me," I said, watching as he froze, as something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. Not here. Not ever again. He looked like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to yell, to fight, to force me to bow to him the way I had once done without question. But something in my voice must have registered, must have finally clicked into place, because he took a step back instead, his teeth grinding together as his jaw clenched. I exhaled slowly, keeping my eyes on them both as I delivered the final blow. "You have until the end of the day to decide," I repeated, making it clear that I wasn't going to say it again. "You take the deal, or you walk out of here with nothing. Either way, this is the last time we will ever have this conversation." My mother's breathing was uneven, her eyes red-rimmed and glassy, her fingers twitching in her lap as she tried to process everything. My father, however, was already moving toward the door, his entire body radiating fury, his footsteps heavy against the floor. "Come on," he barked, grabbing my mother's arm as he pulled her up from her chair. "We're leaving." She hesitated for only a second before she followed him, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she was dragged toward the exit. I watched as they reached the door, waiting to see if either of them would turn back, if either of them would find the words to make this moment something different. But they didn't. The door slammed shut behind them, and just like that, they were gone. And for the first time in my life, I felt nothing but relief. The silence that followed their exit was heavier than I expected, pressing against my chest like a weight I had carried for years. I exhaled slowly, running a hand along the polished surface of my desk, grounding myself in the reality of what had just happened. My parents had walked out without accepting my offer, without another plea, without a final attempt to manipulate me into giving them what they wanted. They had left in anger, in frustration, in disbelief that the son they had abandoned was no longer bound by the strings they had once so carefully tied around me. I had expected them to hesitate, to argue, to threaten me with guilt the way they always had when I was younger. I had imagined my mother breaking down into sobs, my father making one final demand, something cruel, something cutting, something to leave a mark. But they had simply walked out, their pride too thick to let them do anything else, their refusal to accept that they had lost more powerful than their desperation. I wasn't naive enough to believe that this was the end of it. I knew them too well. My parents had built their entire lives on their ability to manipulate, to twist reality to suit their needs, to bend people into submission with carefully chosen words and expectations. They had spent years convincing themselves that they were always in control, that no matter what happened, they would find a way to land on their feet. They had always believed that I would never be strong enough to stand against them, that I would always give in when it mattered most. But they had underestimated me. They had spent years thinking they were making me weak when, in reality, they had made me untouchable. It took them less than 24 hours to call me again. I was in the middle of reviewing financial reports when my phone buzzed on my desk, my mother's name flashing across the screen like a ghost from the past. I let it ring for a few seconds, staring at the name, watching as the notification pulsed insistently, waiting for me to answer. I considered ignoring it, letting them sit in the silence of their own making, but a small part of me was curious, wondering just how far they would go now that they knew their usual tactics wouldn't work. I let out a slow breath before finally answering, keeping my tone neutral, my voice giving nothing away. "Hello." For a moment, there was silence, just the faint sound of her breathing on the other end, as if she were carefully choosing her words, weighing each syllable before speaking. Then, finally, her voice came through, soft and composed, laced with the kind of careful regret that had once fooled me into believing she cared. "Sweetheart," she said, and I could almost picture her sitting in their perfectly decorated living room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression a carefully crafted mask of sadness. "I know things got heated yesterday, but I want you to know that your father and I have been thinking about what you said." I said nothing, letting the words settle between us, letting her sit in the silence of my lack of reaction. She took a deep breath, as if studying herself before continuing. "We understand that you're upset, and maybe we didn't handle things the right way in the past," she continued, her voice carefully measured. "But you have to understand that we were only doing what we thought was best for you." I closed my eyes for a brief second, exhaling through my nose, keeping my voice steady when I responded. What you thought was best for me. I repeated, my tone sharper now, cutting through the false sincerity in her words. Do you really believe that leaving your child in the middle of the woods with no way to get home was something justifiable? She hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for me to know that she still didn't see what she had done as wrong. It was a mistake, she admitted finally, though the words were forced, begrudging, as if she had only said them because she knew it was what I wanted to hear. But we never thought you wouldn't come home. We never thought you would stay away for so long. I let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. You didn't think I would stay away? I asked, my voice low now, dangerous in a way that made my own skin prickle. You thought I would come crawling back, didn't you? You thought I would suffer just enough to learn my lesson, but not enough to cut you out completely. She didn't respond, because we both knew I was right. My father's voice came through then, sharp and controlled, the same voice he had always used when he wanted to regain control of a conversation. Enough with the dramatics, he said, as if I were still 16, as if I would still flinch under the weight of his authority. We'll take the deal. I felt something in my chest tighten, something deep and unfamiliar, something almost close to satisfaction. You'll take the deal, I repeated, making sure I had heard him correctly. A long pause. Yes. I let the silence stretch between us again, let them feel the weight of their own decision, let them sit in the reality of what they had just agreed to. They had spent their entire lives believing they would always have the upper hand, that I would always be the child they could control, that no matter what happened, I would always belong to them. But now, they were the ones trapped in a lesson they didn't want to learn. I reached for the pen on my desk, twirling it between my fingers as I finally spoke. I'll make the arrangements, I said, my voice even, unaffected. Be ready by 7 in the morning. I'll send a driver to pick you up. Another long pause. Then, my mother's voice, quiet, hesitant. Where are you taking us? I smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of my lips, one they couldn't see but would feel all the same. Somewhere remote, I said, my voice eerily calm. Somewhere without phones, without money, without an easy way back. I could hear the sharp inhale on the other end of the line, the way my mother's breath caught in her throat, the way my father's silence was suddenly deafening. You wanted a lesson, I said, my voice dropping into something cold, something final. Now it's time for you to learn. I ended the call before they could respond, and for the first time in my life, I knew they would never forget this moment. The morning air was crisp, the sky painted in muted shades of blue and gray as the first hints of daylight stretched across the horizon. I stood at my office window, coffee in hand, watching as the city began to stir beneath me, headlights cutting through the early fog, people moving with purpose, unaware of the reckoning unfolding just a few floors below. The car I had sent for my parents had arrived precisely at 7, just as promised, sleek and black, waiting at the curb with the kind of quiet authority that spoke volumes. I had given them one final opportunity to change their minds, to realize that pride would not serve them here, to walk away before they found themselves trapped in something far greater than they had anticipated. But when my assistant called to confirm that they had gotten into the car without question, I knew there was no turning back. They still thought they could negotiate, that at the last moment, I would change my mind, that somewhere beneath the years of abandonment, I still held a soft spot for them, a weakness they could exploit. They were wrong. The journey was long, stretching further and further away from the city, from the comfort of familiarity, from the illusion of control they had always maintained. The driver I had chosen was efficient and silent, a man who followed instructions without question, someone I trusted to ensure that the lesson I was delivering would unfold exactly as planned. I had deliberately avoided telling them where they were going, allowing them to sit in the discomfort of the unknown, just as I had all those years ago when I had stood alone in the forest, the sound of their car fading into nothing. They had left me with no answers, no lifeline, no explanation, only the weight of my own survival pressing against me like a vice. Now it was their turn. By the time the car came to a stop, Hours had passed, the landscape around them shifting from civilization to wilderness, the air colder, sharper, unkind. I had chosen the location carefully, a remote, rarely traveled stretch of land nestled between mountains and thick, sprawling woods, miles away from the nearest town, farther still from anyone who might be inclined to help. There was a single dirt path leading out, winding and treacherous, and beyond that, nothing but silence. The driver stepped out, opening the door with the same efficiency as ever, his voice calm as he delivered the final instruction. "You're here." I had insisted that they take nothing with them but the clothes they wore, no wallets, no phones, no easy way to call for rescue. My father was the first to step out, his posture tense, his gaze sweeping the unfamiliar surroundings, his mind already calculating, already searching for the loophole, the escape. My mother hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, the reality of the situation sinking into her bones, her carefully composed mask slipping as she turned toward the driver with wide, uncertain eyes. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice teetering on the edge of forced calm, as if she still believed that reason could pull them from the depths of this unfolding nightmare. "Where exactly are we?" The driver said nothing, only nodding toward the trees, the towering expanse of wilderness that stretched beyond them, endless and indifferent. "This is a joke," my father snapped, his voice tight, anger simmering just beneath the surface as he took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "Take us back. Now." The driver didn't respond. He simply turned, walked back to the car, and shut the door behind him. The engine rumbled to life, the tires kicking up dust and gravel as the car reversed slowly, methodically, the moment stretching into something unbearable. And then, just like that, he was gone. The realization hit them both at the same time, their bodies going rigid as the sound of the car disappeared into the distance, leaving them in nothing but the deafening quiet of the forest. For the first time in their lives, they were powerless. I imagined them standing there, my father pacing in agitation, my mother wringing her hands, her voice trembling as she turned to him, waiting for an answer. But there would be none. There was no shortcut, no easy way back, no carefully crafted lie to erase the reality of what was happening. They would have to walk. I had left them with a path, just as they had left one for me years ago, winding and uncertain, a test of endurance, a lesson in humility. The road was not impossible, but it was long, stretching for miles before they would see even the faintest sign of civilization. They would grow hungry. They would grow cold. They would learn what it meant to be at the mercy of something far greater than their own will. I had spent hours in that forest as a teenager, my stomach aching with hunger, my body shivering with exhaustion, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had done to deserve such cruelty. I had screamed their names, my voice cracking against the vast emptiness, the desperation clawing at my throat. But they had never turned back. So neither would I. I had left them a note, just as they had once left me, tucked into my mother's coat pocket, waiting to be found. The words were simple, deliberate, echoing with a familiarity they would not be able to ignore. "Find your own way home. This is your lesson." I didn't need to see their reactions to know what they felt when they read it. The weight of it, the cruel mirror of the past, the undeniable truth that they had created this moment, that their own actions had led them here. I imagined my father cursing under his breath, his rage a futile fire burning inside him, one that could not warm him against the cold reality of what was happening. I imagined my mother's hands shaking as she clutched the paper, her lips parting in silent horror, the realization sinking into her bones like ice. I had given them exactly what they had given me. Nothing more, nothing less. I didn't expect to hear from them after that. Whether they made it out or not, whether they learned something or not, was no longer my concern. They had chosen their path years ago, and now they had been forced to walk it. For years, I had carried the weight of their choices, the burden of their absence, the scars of their lessons carved into my skin. But as I stood there, watching the city move beneath me, feeling the warmth of the sun spilling through the glass, I realized something. I was free. Not just from them, not just from the memories, but from the story they had written for me, the one where I was always the desperate child, the one who needed them, the one who would always come back. But I was not that child anymore. And for the first time, I knew that I never would be again.